Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first instalment of this three-part webinar series covering trauma-sensitive instruction and leadership in schools with John F. Eller and Tom Hirk. I'm Lauren Mitchell, an editor at Hawker Brownlow Education, which is based in Naarm, Melbourne, and I'm joining you today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, Hawker Brownlow Education acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. For those who aren't familiar with Hawker Brownlow Education, we empower F to 12 teachers and educational professionals with the tools, skills, and resources to help improve classroom performance and raise student achievement. A couple of tips for today's session before we get started. Please use your chat box for any technical questions and send them to the user named Hawker Brownlow Education. That's me, and hopefully I will be able to help you out. You will be placed on mute during the webinar. So please type in the chat box if you've got any questions. Ensure that you choose all attendees and panelists just so that we can all see and all engage with that. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please throw those questions in the chat box. Now, knowing today that we are talking about trauma-sensitive instruction and leadership, specifically understanding trauma, I understand that you may wish to keep your questions private perhaps. So if you're comfortable, please feel free to just directly send those to me. I will read them out anonymously. I won't attach your name to them at all if you wouldn't like me to. So if you need to contact us after today or even during today's session, please reach us via email at info@hbe.com.au. You can also follow HBE at all the usual places on social media. You can find past webinars and other video resources just like this session on our YouTube channel at Hawker Brownlow Ed. One last thing to note before we do get started and I start to introduce you to John and Tom, as we will be discussing trauma-sensitive instruction and leadership today, there will be some discussions of trauma, specifically because we are talking about understanding trauma and how that impacts students. So just be aware of that. Reach out to those around you if you do need help, but just letting you know that that is what we will be covering today, and it is a heavy topic, and that's why we're here. So let me introduce you now to John F. Eller. John is a former principal, director of a principal's training centre and assistant superintendent for curriculum, learning and staff development. He is also a much sought after consultant to schools both nationally and internationally. John specialises in trauma-informed teaching and leadership, school turnaround, dealing with difficult people, building professional learning communities, developing strategic planning strategies, building supervisory skills, and implementing effective teaching strategies. Tom Hirk has been an educator since 1983 in roles including teacher, school leader, Department of Education project leader, and executive director. Tom is a compelling presenter, infusing his message of hope with strategies drawn from the real world. He understands that educators face unprecedented challenges and knows which strategies will best serve learning communities. His presentations explore the importance of positive learning environments and the role of assessment in improving student learning. John and Tom, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'll hand over to you now to run our first webinar session in the three-part series. This one is about understanding trauma. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Lauren. I'll share my screen. So welcome, everybody. As Lauren said, our session today is on understanding trauma, and we have two other webinars scheduled for leading trauma and then also helping teachers with trauma. So good morning. Where Tom and I are located, it's not morning any longer, but we understand it's morning for you, so welcome. We like to integrate some quotes into our presentations, and this one really fits this topic because when every day we have a choice, and we can really make our kids' lives successful, or we can come and not be awesome. So we feel like it's great to wake up, be awesome, and make a difference in kids' lives. As
So
we
we
think
also
about
recognize, sorry, John.
Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, everybody. Listen, we also recognize that sometimes awesome might be a hard choice, right? Awesome's not always achievable. What we do to encourage you, though, is to make sure you're bringing your best every day, right? That you bring your best that you've got. We're going through probably the most unique time, the most challenging time that John and I can think of during our combined 70 plus years as educators. So it's a choice. How did you wake up today? What did you decide to do? Because I know if you woke up and decided to have a bad day, you're likely to be having a bad day right now. It's available to you at every corner. You don't even have to look very far, right? That person who cut you off in traffic this morning, it's because they know you chose a bad day. That cold cup of coffee or tea you had this morning, it's because somebody knew you were having a bad day. Everything starts to fit. What we really need to make sure is that we aren't striving to be on the cutting edge of average, right? That we're really pushing ourselves to our maximum each day.
All right, thanks, Tom. This quote goes with a story. And before my present position, I worked with teachers in a master's program. They came on the weekends and they developed an action research project. But during the first weekend together, I was trying to build community. And I gave the teachers a grid that had 13 spaces on it. And I asked them to fill in what were their most significant memories from their pre-kindergarten through 12th grade years. And when working with over 500 teachers for about 10 years, almost none of the teachers put anything about content down. Most of the teachers put down something to do with relationship or an emotional connection they had with their teacher. So, for example, a teacher maybe lifted them up and helped them get better, or a teacher accepted them the way that they were, or a teacher went out of their way to help them. And that is something that happened in my life. And as you probably know, Tom and I both had backgrounds that had trauma in them. And my 7th grade social studies teacher accepted me the way I was and built a relationship with my family. So that was the emotional turning point of my particular life as a child.
We also know that during the pandemic, during the time of remote instruction, there wasn't a kid who missed the pedagogy. They missed the people. They missed the relationships. They missed spending time with some of the most significant adults they have in their lives.
So this session is based on the work in 2 of our most current books, Trauma Sensitive Instruction, which is designed primarily for teachers, and then Trauma Sensitive Leadership, which is sensitive. So we'd like to start off with a definition, and I've been working with some schools recently, and there's a lot of confusion around this idea of trauma. And so Tom and I found this definition, which really sums up the whole aspect of trauma. And there's some key points in this definition. First of all, the term exceptional. So this isn't just something that has happened to a child that's kind of normal. This is something out of the ordinary. And then powerful and dangerous, those are other key elements, because as we saw before the pandemic and was reinforced during the pandemic, is lots of kids were in jeopardy. And with all of the emotions that were happening, they were in some dangerous situations. And then finally, the last part of the definition, which is really meaningful, is the idea of overwhelming the capacity to cope. So as children grow, they begin to learn skills to kind of cope with what's happening, but these are things that actually overwhelm that capacity for them to cope. And as Tom said, during the pandemic, we saw many, many cases of children because many of us had virtual learning going on and we had a window into their world. For the first time, educators really saw some of the issues that were happening in the homes. So we want to share a little bit about some of the background of trauma. And in the United States, this started, first of all, educators have known that children were in trauma for a long time. But in the 1990s, there was a study done between the Centers for Disease Control in the States and Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente is an insurance company that deals with health. And what they did was they looked at some of the more common events that cause trauma, and then they connected those, or they looked at the connection of those between adult health and adult happiness. And some of these early childhood events were things like neglect and abuse, and maybe drug abuse in the family, sexual abuse, a parent who was incarcerated. And what this study found is that events that happened prior to adulthood, which were up to age 18, they had really definite impacts in people's health as they grew older. And since the original ACEs study, in the States, each state studies some of the issues related to childhood trauma, and they're finding that there's new things that have come in since that time period. And this is based on some research by the US Department of Health and Human Services, but these are some of the more current issues, in addition to those original 10 ACEs areas that are really impacting students in a traumatic way. So I'm not going to read all of them, but extreme poverty. So when children live in poverty generation after generation, that becomes an adverse event. Racism, which we're seeing a rise in racism, at least in the United States. So again, that causes traumatic experience. Exposure to community violence. I was doing some work with a middle school in the St. Louis area, and when I was arriving at the school, the person I took a cab to the school, and the person told me that every evening there's some gunshots in that community, and when the kids came in the morning, you could tell they were nervous and they were actually on edge, and so constant community violence also causes a trauma response. And then it's interesting because the last one on the list, overly punitive school discipline, this is associated with the practice where students, when they are disruptive, they're put into isolation. And many states in the US have banned this because it also causes trauma in youth. So what we'd like to do now is we have a short video that talks a little bit about this idea of resilience. And one of the things that happens in a trauma situation with a family is you may see a different reaction from one sibling to another. So this video gives you a little bit of background related to that. So we're going to show the clip, and then afterwards I'm going to have Tom sum this up. So the clip's about 2 or 3 minutes, and we've been showing this to teacher groups that we've been working with, and it is really providing a lot of insight for them about some of the behaviors that they're seeing in their students.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
So, what we really like about that representation, and it's a very short clip from the Harvard Institute, is how quickly it summarizes. I know for me, the first time I saw it, I love the notion of the scale, the sliding scale with that fulcrum in the middle. And that we know that the experiences kids come to school with shift a little bit on that fulcrum. But what I'm really wanting as a takeaway is the power we have in schools to shift that work, to slide the fulcrum along. In other words, when kids come to school, we can overcome some of the challenges they've seen as a result of what they bring to school. That the most powerful elements are those relationships that we build. And so you saw a number of references to that notion of developing that particular strength in all of our kids, that it's not just reserved for some. If I could choose one word to summarize my 39 years as an educator, I would choose the word relationships. I've yet to meet a kid who is connected who disappoints. We also from that clip can see that some kids are more genetically predisposed. Look, we don't know what is the trigger. We don't know how anyone is going to respond to a traumatic event or a fear-inducing event. What might be fear-inducing for me could well be something that John just looks at and says, that's not that big a deal. It doesn't make my reaction wrong. So the impact we see is also very personal. And therefore, the strategies we employ have to also be personalized to the student and to the situation.
So as Tom said, each child has maybe a slightly different reaction to trauma. And as educators, what we need to do is build a relationship and then accept them for what they are. And then will begin to build a trusting relationship. They'll be able to start to talk with you. And again, we're not trying to solve the traumatic issue. We're just trying to help the student have a safe place to come. This slide kind of sums up a little bit what Tom said with the resilience aspect. And what I'm going to share now is another part of our book, which is really important, which is understanding what's happening when our brain is under stress and experiencing trauma. And you probably have heard terms like complex trauma or ongoing trauma. And as we talk about this brain anatomy, you're going to see how those work. So in the normal brain, it tries to protect us and give us pleasure and make patterns and that sort of thing. And in the lower right-hand corner, there's a small diagram or small picture of a brain. And the area that is in tan, that's at the base, kind of near the number 11, that's the more automatic part of the brain. And some people call that the reptilian brain. So basically, that part of the brain controls heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, all of the kind of automatic features. But it also serves to protect us when we're under attack. So back in times before we had a lot of civilization, that was really important because a wild animal was attacking you, or if another person was attacking you, then your brain could react very quickly. The part of the brain that's showing in color here, that is the area where a lot of cognition and problem solving and processing goes on. And so when a person's under stress, what happens is our body secretes hormones and the blood supply is focused on the tannish part of the brain, cognitive problem solving, because we just react. So what's happening with complex trauma is that the person is having several trauma events happening in their life. And so they have one trauma event upon another, the brain doesn't get relaxed. When they have ongoing trauma, that's where the trauma is continuous. And again, they're not having an opportunity to go back to what we call the steady state of the brain, problem solving and that sort of thing. So it helps to take out some of the personal issue when there's either withdrawal from class or they strike out or whatever. So this is an important thing to think about. And then we got some more information from a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. And this one actually, the book is good, and it talks about how you work with students from different cultures to help them learn and feel connected, that sort of thing. But the part that we picked out is really more scientific evidence about what happens to the brain when it's under stress. So fear and stress activates a small portion of the brain called the amygdala. Oh, Tom says we're getting squares on the screen. Okay. I'm seeing normal, so I'm not sure what's happening, Tom. Anyway, the amygdala is the part of the brain that is controlling the secretion of a hormone called cortisol. And when cortisol is secreted, all learning stops for 20 minutes. Now, cortisol can stay in the body for up to 3 hours. And so if a child's had a traumatic event at home, then what happens is they bring it to school, and for maybe another 2 hours, their body is still focused on the fight or flight. Trust will deactivate the amygdala, and it blocks the release of cortisol. So this is a quote. Again, go ahead, Tom.
So again, the key aspect of that last slide, when cortisol is in the body, all learning stops, right? And so it may be that you are your awesome self and you greet the kid that morning and you wonder why you don't get a response. You can't take that personally, right? It's what they've experienced before they've arrived. And our rush to try and get some teaching happening, or maybe a rush to consequence because we didn't get the desired response, is actually not going to help to calm things down. It's not going to help the body to metabolize that cortisol.
So this next slide kind of goes back to the relationship aspect we talked about. And that's the idea of helping the students feel that you have an interest in them and that you support them. So another piece of the book that is really helpful is we based on some of the work of Neely, Oprah, and Scruggs Hussein. They found that there are what they call 8 R's for trauma-sensitive schools and classrooms. The first 3 listed, or the first 4 listed here, are actually aspects related to the teacher's attitude or mindset. And then the second set that we're going to look at in a minute are things related to the classroom environment. So in this one, we've got the element of realize, and that's raising the awareness that there could be issues. And again, as Tom said earlier, during the pandemic especially, teachers really became aware of some of the things that were happening. You might step into their space is a trigger and causes them to reimagine the trauma that's happened to them. The R of respond, that is, how do we interact so it's productive? Sometimes teachers who themselves had trauma may be too harsh on students, or they may be too soft on students. Sometimes teachers who have never experienced trauma may have the same reactions. So we want to make sure that what we do is productive. Then finally, the last or the fourth R in this set is about how do we not jump to judgment? So for example, if a student acts out in class, sometimes teachers can immediately take it personally, when in fact, it might not have anything to do with us as teachers. So the fourth R of resist is the ability to suspend your reaction to truly understand the situation.
And it's the most challenging of the ones, right? Because sometimes, you know, as I said, you're being your awesome self and you're not getting a response, and you wonder, and maybe it's on that day where your energy reserves are a little less. And so it's easy to jump to conclusions and want to have some kind of reaction.
The second set of R's, the 4 R's, relate to the classroom environment. So these are aspects that teachers can control. They can make the environment more predictable, more stable. Now, before I go through these 4, if you think about some of the students in these trauma situations, their life's very unpredictable and chaotic. What we can do to provide order and predictability can really help students so that they know what's going to happen next. So the first of these last 4 R's is routines. These are aspects like how do you come in the classroom, how do you start class, procedures that are consistent and friendly for students to be successful. Rituals, those are like routines, but they're more emotional in nature. So for example, if you have morning meetings, maybe you celebrate all the children that are there, and the students are trying to give each other a compliment. So again, it's a little more emotional, and it's a part of building that emotional connection. Relationships, we've talked a little bit about relationships before, but the idea that you're accepting the students as they are, and you're trying to build a connection with them. And then finally, the last R of this set is what's called regulation. This is where teachers actually help students to understand the emotions and then regulate the emotions. And we've seen classrooms where teachers are actually teaching kids, when you feel upset, what do you do next? Or if you start to get angry at someone else, and they have several steps that students go through. So again, these last R's are related to the classroom environment.
And sometimes we see it in terms of having calming spaces, either in the classroom itself, an area that's behind the curtain, a sensory room, potentially in the school. We've seen in high schools, calming spaces where kids can go to just help themselves get better at self-regulating before the situation gets even more inflamed.
So back to the R of relationships. And again, as Tom said, this says it all, that without relationships, there's no learning. And this one deals with the idea of what we call dysregulated or dysregulated student, which sometimes causes them to act irrationally. And again, this quote's kind of nice because the very bottom part is, it's not about us. It's about something else possibly, and we need to think about that so that we don't react. That gets us to the idea of classroom management, and we talk about 4 really important variables that are involved in classroom management. First of all, development and teaching of what we call common and sensible routines and procedures. So basically, you don't just expect that the students come with understanding these procedures, but you actually take them and teach them as lessons. Item number 2, the idea of discipline, classroom discipline or management. It's a learning process for kids. Number 3, it kind of fits underneath the triggers that we talked about earlier. What is it that could be behind this behavior? And then how do we, now that we understand it, how do we deal with that? And then finally, item 4, that's the idea of trying to help the student get more into a steady state so that they can actually rationalize a situation. And we've seen this kind of practice occurring among students where there's these conflict managers that schools develop, and then they sit down and actually work with the kids, and each student gets to share their side of the story, and then they come up with a solution. So they're able to, now that the conflict is over, then they can think through and think about what they should have done differently. So again, this kind of is back to the idea of attention seeking and discipline. And again, if we think of attention seeking, that sends us in a different direction than if we think of connection seeking, that the student's actually trying to connect with us. It really changes your perspective. So we have another short clip of the classroom that we'd like to share with you. And we use this when we work with teachers so that they can actually see, what does this look like when it's starting in a classroom situation? So I'll play this, and then Tom and I will debrief, and then we're going to be wrapping up here in just a couple of minutes.
What does it mean to make the world a better place?
Nice! So those are those big questions we're focusing on. For me, being trauma-informed has so much to do with mindset, accepting that different people come into a school setting with incredibly varied life experiences. Some of those life experiences may be traumatic, and the way in which that plays out in my particular classroom could look a number of ways. And by me having that lens, it makes it less about are they doing the right thing or the wrong thing, and more about where is that behavior coming from, why is that happening.
Adverse childhood experiences like poverty, neglect, exposure to violence can bring about overwhelming stress, which can cause negative effects on the learning brain and on behavior. If children have the experience of adversity, they will have uneven development of these foundational skills like self-regulation and executive function or relationship skills. these are the children who are at risk to fall further and further behind. But the good news is that there is a powerful antidote to stress, and that is the effect of the human relationship and the presence of trust. Schools are an ideal place to produce many different kinds of relationships that are capable of buffering stress. Schools themselves can be healing places.
If you're fearful, if you're anxious, if you're distracted about something that's happened to you, you literally can't learn. Your brain shuts down. So it's essential to give kids social and emotional tools that allow students to recover from the challenges that they have experienced. Take actual classroom time to work on the building blocks of how to perceive your emotions, how to talk about them, how to get along with other people, how to take a moment and become calm when you need to, how to express your needs so that others can meet them.
When we start to understand what it takes to be responsive to the effects of trauma, we need to think about the environment, about individual services, and we need to think about the skills and mindsets of kids that won't develop as they should when they're impacted by trauma.
I do a lot of work around self-awareness and being able to name emotions and then make a choice around those.
When I get mad, I take deep breaths, and that helps me get more calm.
Many of the things that we think about doing for kids who may have experienced trauma are good for everybody. And everyone will encounter some kind of adverse circumstance at some point in their life. And for some children, we're helping them deal with what's already happened in their lives. For others, we're preparing them to deal with the challenges later in their lives.
If you can hear my voice say, "We are awesome."
And I know Tom has some thoughts on this video, so I'm going to let him share for a moment, and then I want to add a few thoughts.
Yeah, so I think there's some powerful pieces there. Number one, again, the reminder from Cantor about the value, the importance of relationships, that schools have that powerful antidote. Listen, we talk often in the work we do about when kids come to school, they're coming to our house. It's the only house over which we have any control. We've got to stop lamenting what happens in the other house because we do have the capacity. And I also like what Darling Hammond says at the end. Whether or not a kid is experiencing trauma right now isn't as relevant as we are preparing them, because we know ultimately, as I'm sure everyone who's participating here today has gone through some challenges in their own lives. That's just life. We all go through some difficult moments. And so arming kids with these skills is an essential component. I hope when we emerge fully post-pandemic that we recognize social emotional learning as being on par with reading and writing and arithmetic as an essential skill in order for all of our children to be growing up as young women and men, functional adults making valuable, viable contributions.
And schools who strive to become trauma sensitive find that the strategies that they use to help the students experiencing trauma are good for all kids. And as Tom alluded to, this becomes almost a new way of instruction, becomes a part of what we're teaching kids, problem solving and de-escalation skills that they're going to use later in life. And we like this quote because the trauma sensitive journey is not something that just happens because you will it to happen. It takes a lot of work and a lot of persistence. So we're nearing the end of the webinar, and we want to quickly kind of sum up some of the takeaways that we hope that you got. So the webinar was really designed to provide more of a general awareness of trauma, and then some of the aspects that schools can use in order to become trauma focused, trauma sensitive, and also help teachers understand what's happening so that they can help their classrooms become trauma sensitive. So we hope that you've gained some perspective. As we work with schools and teachers and leaders, we find that it's nice to give them an overview, but we do spend more time going through some more details and having them discuss and work together to see what's happening within their school. But this basic understanding of trauma and what's happening really helps to develop the beginning of a mindset change that we think is really helpful as teachers move toward trauma-sensitive instruction. So with that, thank you for joining us today. I'll let Tom share any parting thoughts, and then Lauren, I think, is going to pose some questions.
Yeah, no, we do appreciate everyone's participation here today. Again, we appreciate the support of Hawker Brownlow, and I know, as I saw in the chat box, they've got your ability to access the 2 books. Listen, John and I really hope you'll get the books and share with us your insights. These represent our collected thoughts and work. We've shared a little bit of the content with you here today. We hope you'll join us for the next 2 as well, where we'll continue to dive in to some of the content and maybe spark some further interest. So Lauren, over to you.
Thank you both so much for that first session in the 3-part series. I do have a couple of questions from our webinar participants. So first up, how can you empathize with trauma-impacted students if you haven't personally experienced traumatic events yourself? So it's a case of how do we put ourselves in those shoes? How do we navigate this fear when we don't actually have personal experience of these situations?
Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, having both of us having gone through that, we often find that even when we share our stories, it's about also wanting people to recognize you don't have to have gone through this to empathize with this, right? It is about understanding that, as I mentioned earlier, an event can be traumatizing, whether or not it is for you, if it is for me. To understand the impact, and that's what we've tried to outline a little bit in the book, that when cortisol is released, that learning shuts down. And so to take a step back from not getting the desired response you want. The data is clear. 1 in 6 students is going through severe stressors in their lives, right? So 1 out of 6 is a pretty significant number. And so how do we empathize with that? That's part of the challenge. John, what do you want to add?
In the book, we talk about a skill called temporary suspension of opinion, which is really valuable because it helps teachers and educators actually step back and temper a reaction and try to understand what else could be behind this. So I think that whether you've had trauma or not, if you develop the sense of what we call empathy and the ability
I think we might have just lost John there. Tom, are you able to pick up that thread?
Oh, he's back.
Oh,
John, we lost you on the last part of your comment.
I'm back. Yes. So I think that if you can have empathy, then that helps you to understand.
Mm-hmm. And a second question that we do have is kind of the flip of that, and I think we're going to be coming up to this in a subsequent webinar rather. How do I, if I have been impacted by trauma, keep myself safe and healthy and well when working in these spaces, caring for students, and again, putting myself in that same position and understanding where to take things?
Yeah, we talk a little bit about this whole notion of secondary traumatic stress, right? Where we get so engaged with what's going on. And it's not unlike what you might see with people who have gone through war, people who have gone through other significant events, their post-traumatic stress disorder. There is the potential for us to get really drawn into some of that. And we have to be cautious. Leaders in particular have to be aware of some of the signs and some of the symptoms. Equally, we can be transformed, right? So inspired by what has happened. And I think about what's going on today in the world. On the last webinar John and I did, we actually had a principal join us from the Ukraine. and he was asking for any advice on how to deal with trauma during war events. And my goodness, that caught both of us. You know, we had to sort of think about. And the reality is that what we're going through is similar. You know, the response needs to be similar. And so I think we have to make sure we don't get too drawn in. That's where teams can help. That's where leadership can help, to be alert to, similar as we would see with kids. Is this a typical reaction of that adult colleague of ours, or is there something else underpinning it?
In schools, we do a really good job of caring for students, but we don't really take very good care of ourselves. So Tom and I work with schools to help them develop, first of all, an awareness that the staff is under stress and experiencing trauma. And then how are they going to care for themselves? And we start very simple with having them do things like drink more water, exercise, go home from work at a decent time. And then we help them develop a plan. And as school leaders, we also need to be really aware of this, because it's really easy, I think, for educators to continue to work and work and work, even though their own batteries are depleted. So the focus on self-care and then educator care, those are a couple of things that are really important.
Yeah,
and it's interesting because
the one phrase we keep having people remind themselves of, you know, self-care is healthcare, right? Self-care is healthcare. We got to make sure we are much more adept and aware of that need.
And under the pandemic and now the supposed recovery from the pandemic, educators are still under great stress. And when Tom and I work with them, we get people coming up at our workshops telling us about their experiences or their current experiences with stress. And they, again, we're just not very good at that. We need to get better at that understanding.
I think that is all of the questions that did come through, and that is all that we have time for today. But we will be back on 10 a.m. on Tuesday, the 17th of March. And this session will actually also be available online within 7 to 14 days. It's usually on the shorter side of that. So if you'd like to share this session with any colleagues or friends who might be interested in it, you'll definitely find that online soon. You'll be able to share that. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know it is not easy taking time out of your busy day, and on the second day of term, no less, I think. And we do appreciate you being here. You can find trauma-sensitive instruction and leadership and the coming 2 webinars in this series and much, much more at hbe.com.au. And finally, a really big thank you to both John and Tom for joining us today and sharing their insights with us. We wish everyone a great term ahead, and we'll see you all right back here on Tuesday, the 17th of March. Thank you all.
Thanks, Lauren. And I know you mean the 17th of May.
I absolutely do. Thank you. Yes. See everyone on the 17th of May.
Yes.
Thanks for looking after me.
Yes. Well, you've taken such good care of us here this afternoon or this morning. We appreciate it. Thanks everybody for participating, taking time out of your busy day. We hope you'll bring a friend with you next time.